It began with something too small to feel important at the time. Jane had been sitting still for hours, long enough for the forest to forget her shape. The air hung heavy with damp leaves and the slow, insect-thick rhythm of midday. Nothing dramatic moved through the clearing, just the usual sounds, a distant bird settling, the faint rustle of feeding somewhere uphill. The chimpanzees were present but dispersed, their bodies mostly hidden by undergrowth and shadow. Then one juvenile shifted position. It wasn't sudden, just a change in angle, a pause that lasted half a second longer than expected. Jane noted it without writing anything down. Young chimps often wander closer before losing interest again. Curiosity, then retreat. Predictable, but this one didn't retreat. He sat where he was, head tilted slightly, eyes fixed in her direction, not wide, not alarmed, just steady. His breathing was slow. His hands rested loosely on the ground, fingers relaxed. No vocalización. No signal to the others. Jane remained motionless. She had learned that stillness, more than distance, defined safety. The forest seemed to hold its breath with her. Somewhere behind the juvenile, an adult shifted weight, then stopped. Jane waited, listening for the cue that would explain the moment. It didn't come, and for the first time that day, she wondered, not what the chimp would do, but why he had decided not to look away. The juvenile eventually looked away, but not in the way Jane expected. His gaze slid sideways, not back into the forest, but toward an older female sitting several meters behind him. The look was brief, almost careless, yet lingered just long enough to register as intentional. The female did not respond. She continued grooming her forearm, slow and methodical, though her fingers paused for a moment before resuming their rhythm. Jane noticed that pause. In chimpanzees, stillness often meant more than movement. A sudden charge was rare without warning. It was these small delays that carried information. She shifted her attention away from the juvenile and began to scan the wider group, carefully, without turning her head too much. The group's spacing had changed. Earlier that morning, the chimpanzees had been loosely arranged, feeding independently, drifting in and out of sight. Now, without any obvious signal, the distances between them had shortened. Not dramatically. No clustering, no huddling. Just fewer empty gaps. Bodies angled slightly inward. A subtle tightening of the social field. No one vocalized. Jane kept her hands visible, resting them lightly on her knees. She had learned long ago that chimpanzees tracked hands more than faces. Hands carried intent. Hers were still, empty, unthreatening. Another juvenile crossed the clearing behind her line of sight, moving from left to right. He did not look at Jane at all. His attention was fixed on the ground, scanning for dropped fruit. But his path curved just slightly, bringing him closer than necessary before veering away again. A test, perhaps, or coincidence. Jane resisted the urge to categorize it too quickly. She listened instead. The forest soundscape had changed, though it would have been difficult for an untrained ear to say how. The insects were still there, but their rhythm felt uneven, as if interrupted by something unspoken. A bird called once, then went quiet. The chimps themselves made no noise beyond the soft friction of movement. Leaf against fur, knuckle against soil. The original juvenile shifted again. This time he leaned forward, placing more weight on his arms. His posture wasn't aggressive. No raised hair, no tension in the shoulders. But it was attentive, purposeful. Jane felt the familiar internal calculation begin. Not fear exactly, but assessment. Distance. Numbers. Escape routes. She had none she would use unless absolutely necessary. Standing or retreating would change the meaning of the moment, possibly in ways she couldn't control. An adult male entered the edge of the clearing. He was not one of the dominant individuals Jane recognized immediately, but he carried himself with quiet confidence. His movements were economical, deliberate. He stopped short of the group and sat back straight, head high. He did not look at Jane. Instead, his gaze moved across the other chimpanzees, checking faces, posture, alignment. The juvenile glanced at him again. This time, the look was longer. Jane felt a tightening behind her ribs. It wasn't based on any single signal, but on the pattern forming between them. Attention was circulating, passing from one individual to another without sound, without gesture. Jane was not excluded from it, but she was not the focus either. Not yet. She thought about her own posture. She had been sitting cross-legged for so long that her legs had gone numb. Slowly, carefully, she shifted her weight, barely lifting one knee and resettling it. The movement was minimal, but she saw the immediate effect. The juvenile froze. Not stiff, not startled, just still. His eyes returned to her face, then dropped to her hands, then back up again. The adult male, at the edge of the clearing, stopped scanning the group and finally looked at Jane directly. Eye contact held for a fraction of a second longer than neutral. Jane lowered her gaze first. Among chimpanzees, staring could be a challenge. She had learned to break eye contact gently, not abruptly, letting her attention drift as if disinterested. She focused on the ground near her feet, tracing the outline of a fallen leaf with her eyes. When she looked up again, the juvenile had moved closer. Only a step, but it closed a distance that had felt stable moments before. No one reacted. That, more than anything else, unsettled her. The group accepted the movement. No warning call, no tension release, just a quiet adjustment, as if the forest itself had shifted slightly off balance, and everyone had decided, without discussion, to see what would happen next. Jane narrowed her attention to the juvenile, not because he was the most powerful or the most dangerous, but because he had become the clearest point of change. In long observations, meaning often gathered around the individual willing to cross an invisible line first. Others followed later, if at all. He stood now, slowly, unfolding his limbs without urgency. His movements were smooth, practiced, lacking the clumsiness typical of his age. Jane had seen this before in young males on the edge of adolescence, an early testing of presence, not dominance yet, but awareness of it. He took another step. Jane did not move. Her breathing remained even, shallow enough not to lift her shoulders. She kept her head angled slightly away, offering the side of her face rather than a direct frontal view. Among chimpanzees, this mattered. Orientation conveyed intent. The juvenile stopped within a few meters, close enough that Jane could see the fine dust clinging to the hair on his forearms. Close enough to hear his breath. Not quickened, not strained, just steady. He looked at her again, then past her, as if checking the space behind her body. Jane registered the direction of his gaze with a flicker of concern. Chimps often oriented themselves toward escape routes when anticipating disruption. But there was nothing behind her but dense vegetation and the narrow trail she had used earlier. She wondered if he was mapping her. He crouched, lowering his body until his knuckles touched the ground. This was not a submissive posture. It was neutral, balanced, ready to move in any direction. Jane felt time stretch. In the field, moments like this rarely came with clarity. They were suspended between interpretation and instinct. She had learned to resist both impulses equally, to neither anthropomorphize nor reduce behavior to a checklist of signs. What mattered was context, and context took patience. The juvenile reached down and picked up a small stick. It was thin, brittle, no more than the length of his forearm. He rolled it between his fingers, testing its flexibility. Jane had seen chimps use sticks for play, for exploration, for feeding. Tool use, even casual, carried layers of meaning, but not always intention. He did not raise it. He tapped it once against the ground. The sound was soft, barely audible. Still, it seemed to ripple through the clearing. The adult male at the edge shifted his weight. The grooming female paused again, this time longer, her hands suspended in the chimp she was grooming. Jane remained still. Her heart rate increased, but she focused on keeping her body calm. Chimps read tension through posture more than pulse. Any sudden change, tightening, leaning, pulling back, could invite response. The juvenile tapped the stick again. Then he looked directly at Jane. The eye contact was steady, not confrontational, but searching. Jane resisted the urge to look away immediately. Instead, she softened her gaze, letting her focus blur slightly, as if looking through him rather than at him. He did not break eye contact. Jane felt a quiet pressure build. Not fear, but responsibility. This was not about whether the chimp would act. It was about how her own behavior might shape whatever came next. Observation, she had learned, was never neutral. Presence altered outcomes even when still. She shifted her hand, just enough to ease the strain in her fingers. The juvenile noticed. His grip on the stick tightened. Not raised, not aimed, just held more firmly. His shoulders lifted a fraction, then settled again. He seemed to reconsider, not in a human way, but in a behavioral one, pausing at the edge of possibility. Jane wondered what he perceived. Did he see her as an object, a moving part of the environment, or as something that responded unpredictably to stimulus? Years of habituation had reduced fear responses in this group, but it had not erased curiosity. The juvenile took one more step. Now he was close enough that Jane could see the whites of his eyes clearly. They were calm, alert, focused. He lowered the stick and placed it on the ground between them. The gesture was unhurried, deliberate. Jane did not reach for it. The space between them held. Around them, the group remained quiet, but the tension had shifted. It was no longer dispersed. It had condensed, focused on this small triangle of attention. The juvenile, the object, the human observer. The adult male stood. Not abruptly. He rose with controlled movement, stretching to his full height. His gaze moved from the juvenile to Jane, then back again. He did not vocalize. He did not advance. Authority without intervention. Jane felt a subtle release. Not relief, but recognition. This was not escalation. It was assessment. The juvenile had reached a limit, not imposed by force, but by presence. The juvenile glanced at the adult male, then back at Jane. After a long pause, he stepped back. Just one step, then another. He did not turn away immediately. He lingered, watching for a response that did not come. Jane remained still, her gaze neutral, her posture unchanged. Finally, he turned and moved back toward the group, leaving the stick where it lay. The clearing exhaled. Movement resumed quietly. Grooming restarted. Foraging continued. The adult male sat again, his attention drifting elsewhere. Jane stayed seated, her body unchanged, but something inside her had shifted. The moment had passed without incident, without resolution. And yet, she knew she would return to it, again and again, trying to understand not what had almost happened, but what had been decided not to. Jane did not move when the group relaxed. She stayed where she was, even after the clearing returned to its earlier rhythms. This was not caution so much as continuity. To stand now would mark the end of something she did not yet understand. The forest had accepted her presence again, but not in quite the same way. Her attention drifted back to the stick. It lay untouched on the ground, already beginning to lose its significance as the soil pressed into it. No chimpanzee reached for it. No juvenile reclaimed it. Objects in a forest were rarely symbolic for long. Meaning dissolved quickly unless reinforced. And yet, Jane felt certain the gesture had mattered. Not as a threat, not as an offering, but as a measure. The realization came slowly, without a clear boundary between thought and feeling. What had shifted was not the chimpanzee's behavior alone, but her interpretation of her own role within it. She had always framed her presence as peripheral, something tolerated, eventually ignored. But the moment suggested something more precise. She had been evaluated, not in the way humans evaluated danger or intent, but in a social sense. The juvenile had not acted impulsively. He had moved with the group behind him, watching, allowing space for correction. The adult male's restraint had not been indifference. It had been permission bound by awareness. Jane thought about the long hours she had spent cultivating stillness, learning which movements dissolved tension and which created it. Habituation, she had believed, worked by reducing novelty. But novelty was not the same as significance. She remained significant. The chimpanzees did not treat her as another chimp, nor as a threat to be expelled. Instead, she occupied an ambiguous category, predictable, readable, but not fully integrated. The juvenile's approach had not been about crossing into her space, but about clarifying the edges of that category. Jane felt a subtle discomfort at the thought. It challenged the comfort of observation as distance. She had not been merely watching behavior unfold. She had been participating in a quiet negotiation of boundaries. The lack of drama did not lessen its weight. If anything, it deepened it. She looked toward the adult male. He was grooming now, his earlier alertness replaced by routine. Whatever assessment had taken place was over. Decisions had been made and filed away, not consciously, but behaviorally. The group would remember without remembering. Jane wondered if the juvenile would try again another day. Not the same way, not with a stick, but with a different variation, another small test, another moment of proximity. Social learning in chimpanzees often unfolded through repetition, through small experiments conducted under the watchful eyes of others. What struck her most was what had not happened. There had been no display, no bluff-charge, no alarm. The juvenile had not been corrected harshly, nor encouraged. The adult male's authority had been expressed through presence alone. And Jane's own restraint, her refusal to respond, had been part of the outcome. She recognized, with a quiet clarity, that her safety had not depended on control. It depended on restraint. Not dominance, not retreat, but the careful maintenance of neutrality. The moment had held because no one rushed to resolve it. The tension had been allowed to exist, examined, and then released. Jane felt a shift in herself, not fear, but humility. The chimpanzees were not unpredictable in the way people often assumed. They were precise, economical. Their social world was governed less by sudden violence than by constant calibration. What seemed like nothing to an outsider was, to them, a complete exchange. She picked up her notebook at last and wrote a few brief lines. Not an interpretation, just observations. Distance closed. Object introduced. Adult male present. No vocalización. She did not write how it had felt. That would come later, perhaps, when memories softened the edges enough to examine them. For now, the understanding was wordless. The forest continued around her, indifferent to insight. But Jane knew something had changed, not in the chimpanzees, but in how carefully she would now watch the moments that almost became something else. Jane left the clearing later than usual that afternoon. There was no clear reason to stay, no new behavior unfolding. Yet she moved slowly, as if the ground itself required more attention. The chimpanzees barely acknowledged her departure. A few glanced up, then returned to feeding. The group had already absorbed the morning's exchange and moved past it. On the narrow trail back, Jane replayed the moment, not to solve it, but to notice its shape. The sequence mattered more than any conclusion. Approach, pause, object, restraint, withdrawal. Each step small, each one contingent on the last. What lingered was the juvenile's hesitation. Not the approach itself, but the moment he stopped. The point at which he could have advanced further and did not. That decision had not been forced. No one had intervened. Nothing obvious had changed in the environment. And yet something had. Jane suspected the answer lived in the space between individuals rather than inside any one of them. Chimpanzee societies were built on these spaces, on what was allowed to continue and what quietly ended. Most of that work happened without sound, without spectacle. She thought again of the stick left on the ground. No one reclaimed it. No one destroyed it. It remained where it was briefly relevant, then forgotten. But the behavior around it, the restraint, the watching, the collective patience, would not be forgotten in the same way. Some boundaries, once tested, did not need to be tested again. As Jane disappeared into the forest, the clearing returned fully to itself. Light shifted. Insects resumed their steady rhythm. The chimpanzees fed, groomed, and rested as they always had. Still, one question remained. Not dramatic, not urgent, but quietly persistent. If that juvenile had taken one more step, would the group have stopped him? Or had they already learned exactly how close was close enough?